We are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
When we planted a Vineyard Church 15 years ago, I was the co-lead pastor of the church, but I led the children's ministry for 3 solid years until we had someone that I trusted that would do it. And I did it unpaid. So I was an unpaid co-lead pastor of a church teaching children, which is great. I love teaching children. But once a month, I would preach in the main adult service. And the other 3 weeks, I was back with the kids. And I did that for a long time. That would be a much, I would say, more rare, probably rare occurrence if that was flipped.
Yeah,
if
I
there
agree.
was, yeah. And are we still doing those things? Absolutely we are. Is God moving through them? Of course.
Of course.
Is he faithful? Yes. Would I like to see a little more equality in that area? Oh, yeah.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. Today's episode is the next installment of a preaching mini-series that's hosted by Adam Russell and Ted Kim. Today they are talking with Melanie Forsythe-Lee, who serves as the lead pastor of Life Vineyard Church in Columbus, Ohio, and also leads the Vineyard USA's Women's Association. Let's listen in.
What's up, Mel? How you doing?
Hello.
Welcome to the pod with Ted and once again, we have taken We Are Vineyard from Jay Pathick. He's trusted us with the family car. He gave us the keys. And we're so happy to have you here. We're talking about preaching. And I think the frame for today's conversation as it relates to preaching in the vineyard is I just want to hear about just women who preach. And I'm sure we're going to get into that, but maybe we should just start here. Melanie, would you just tell us a little bit about your own journey in preaching? How did you start? Do you remember your first sermon? What was the text?
I do.
Yeah,
it was
hit us.
awful. Okay. So I am lucky. I'm really lucky. I grew up in a preaching family. My mom and dad both preached growing up. My dad primarily, and they're both educators in their real jobs, their growing up jobs. So they're intellectuals and they know how to speak. I would travel with my father. We had a church on a Sunday morning that we did. And then Sunday nights, a lot of the time he would preach for his buddies at like Holy Spirit. You know, the Holy Spirit only moves on Sunday nights. So, that was in Australia, he would do the Holy Spirit nights. And we would travel around. And so I was always my dad's sidekick from probably 10 years old on. My mom would stay at home with all of my brothers, and dad and I would go out and he would just preach at these little places all around the place, all of his friends' churches. And so I grew up in that environment of preaching, listening, and then he would listen to preaching on tape. And he favored Black preachers. And so, I would get the kind of what I would call the Pentecostal charismatic style in Australia type of preaching, but then we would also be listening to Black preachers from America. I didn't actually know that there was a lot of white preachers in America. I thought they were all Black. So that's a sidebar. So I grew up there. And then my first husband was a great preacher as well. So I got married at 18. And he preached all the time because we ran a youth ministry that reached hundreds of kids. It was incredible. And so he preached 95% of the time. And he was like a stand-up comic style preacher, fantastic, natural, off-the-cuff type. So I thought I could do that too. So, my first preach, we're going to get there.
Yeah.
I was about 21. It was awful. It was maybe the worst thing I've ever done in my life because I didn't know who I was. My father is a super intellectual, and so I thought maybe I should preach like that. But then my husband was super cool and fun and hip and woke, and so I thought maybe I could preach like him. And it turned into a combination of the both, and I ended up using that terrible music video called Pretty Fly for a White Guy as my opener for my sermon. And I was crucified by the 200 children that were watching me. They all openly mocked and laughed me. And I realized I'm not cool enough to make this work. And I had to pivot halfway through the sermon and just plead for my life is what happened.
Melanie, what was the text?
I don't remember. There's no way I would ever remember, but it was about something about not being a tryhard is really all I had to offer the people. Like, it was the worst sermon of my life.
Oh, man. It's interesting. We've asked a few people about their sermons, and I think it's universal. Your first sermon is bad.
Oh, tanked it.
Dude.
Yeah, I've never preached off a music video ever again. Never.
Okay, let me just ask one more question about finding your voice, because at the beginning of the series, Ted and I, we did a whole episode just on finding your voice, just figuring out how to be you in front of people holding a microphone. How long did that take you?
I'd say about 10 years. I tried everything. I tried every which way.
Was it uncomfortable? Was it an uncomfortable process learning who you were in front of people?
Yes.
Say more about that.
Terribly uncomfortable. Because I was trying to be someone else, you know? I mean, it's the classic Saul's armor on David, you know? And I wanted to be like my dad, who was my hero. I wanted to be cool like my husband. And then I wanted to be like an orator, like the black preachers I grew up listening to that never had a word out of place. You know, I wanted to be anything but myself is the truth. And so I think by the time I started figuring out what my voice was, it was out of sheer exhaustion and the realization that I don't have the time to put in the effort to be anything else other than who I am. And really, it coincided with me becoming a mother of a lot of little kids at the same time, starting a church. All of the exhaustion that came along with that was actually the biggest gift for me because I couldn't show up any other way other than myself or have a nervous breakdown.
Well, say more about who you think you are now. Or what did you find out? Because you used the word mother. That kind of stuck out to me just now.
Yeah.
An exhausted mother. I mean, I just feel that because I remember when Heather and I had 3 kids, there's just no margin in your life anymore, right? Like,
yeah.
So talk to me about how that translates to your preaching now and how you feel about yourself.
Yeah, I definitely approach the way that I preach as mother. I don't think I'll ever preach any other way. And I think because of that, and I know it sounds weird to say mother, but it's the heart of a mother that wants the best for their children, that isn't afraid to say hard truths, but also wants to set the plate and set the stage, right, for total acceptance. Come as you are. Be here. You are welcome. I love you. We have family rules. We have conversations about that. When you step outside of it, there's consequences. But I don't do that because I hate you. I do that because I love you. So welcome back in. Like, you belong. And I'm going to feed you a healthy diet. You're going to eat your peas and your carrots. But I'm also going to give you like apple crisp for dessert. And so we're going to figure out a way that we get the whole picture of what it means to belong to a family. And I just happen to be the mother who gets to curate that. And if I'm honest, the first decade of my preaching, I was preaching so other people thought that I was either intelligent or cool or effective. My preaching was to earn the respect of the people I was communicating to. But a mother doesn't do that with her children. It's a complete... I didn't have the energy to hope that my kids would tell me I'm a great mom. No, like I knew I'm showing up here. I'm your mom, and we're going to work this out together. And so once I let go of the preaching primarily so that other people would think something about me and actually getting to the heart of the message I was trying to communicate, I started really finding my voice.
That's super interesting. Could you play that out for us a little bit?
Yeah.
Like a text, take like maybe even this past Sunday.
Yeah.
What does that look like for you to preach in that voice?
That's such a good question. I feel like, okay, we're in a series called Why the Bible Matters, why it still matters. And for me, as I'm sharing about what is the purpose of the Bible, like, why do we read the Bible? I could go in a million different ways to make myself sound very intellectual and very smart. I can impress people with a bunch of stuff. But that's not really what they want to take home. Most of the people in my congregation aren't going to be blown away by that. So when I stand up and I talk about the purpose of Scripture, I'm like, I'm talking to their hearts. I'm talking about, hey, this is for you to discover who God is and why he made you and your purpose and your identity on planet Earth. So we're going to come at it in the same way as I would have a conversation with my daughter. Hey, I love you. You're born into this family on purpose, for a purpose. And I love you and I see you. And I don't actually care what job you do. I care about your heart. I just want you to serve God and I want you to love your family. I want you to belong here. And so I feel like when I preach even why the Bible matters, I'm preaching it through a lens of this matters for your whole life. I'm not just trying to impress you with a little tidbit that you'll take home and now you can answer a Bible trivia question. Like, this has to matter for your whole life.
Well, it's interesting to listen to you and your journey, Mel. I mean, like, you're talking about finding your own voice, talking about all the different ways that we sort of touch these bases of insecurity or people's expectations on us and whatnot. But one of the things that I've become super aware of is obstacles that particularly women have faced as they occupy the pulpit. And was that part of your story too? And could you riff a little bit on that? Even in the Vineyard?
Look, I think that there's always going to be obstacles. Like when I grew up, there was no obstacles because I was very privileged. I had a father that believed in me and a husband that believed in me. So my female story of coming into preaching is not the norm. I can readily admit I had massive privilege in that area. It wasn't till I hit America that I found myself in the same boat as every other woman, where I wasn't given an opportunity to preach for a very long time. I don't think I preached for 6 years when I first came to America. And, I was in a church that was complementarian. And so that was a struggle. They became a Vineyard church in the midst of that. And what I realized is, number one, big obstacles for women preaching is just getting to preach, period. Like, most pastors hog the mic. That's just what they do.
Yeah.
Like, of all the sucky things that one has to do to be a pastor, preaching is our crowning glory. It's the crown jewel that makes it all worth it. And there's not many pastors that would say different. I mean, they wouldn't say that readily, but in our hearts, it's like, I do all this crap and I deal with all these weird, frustrating things and all these terrible meetings behind the scene. But for 45 minutes on Sunday, I get to speak about the truth of God. I get to stand in front of people. I get to set the direction of the church. I get to say, this is where we're going. I get to pierce the darkness. I get this moment, and it makes all of the other 50 hours of my life worth it, right? Because I get that one spot, that one moment where I get to speak. And that's really hard to give up. And normally you've just got a super annoying associate pastor that's bugging you all the time. And they're on some type of weird tangent where they're reading a bunch of books you don't even want them to read, but they are. And they're going to get up there and push their pet agenda, and it's not going to be really where you want to take the church. So you're like, fine, I'll throw you a bone every 12 weeks. And then the thought of okay, there's other people that want to speak to, that just sounds simply exhausting. So that I think for most women, we're far down the pecking order, and that's a top-down approach. And then also as women, we are creative masters of finding alternate ways to get our message across because of necessity. And so you find a lot of women don't even advocate for pulpit time because we're so accustomed to not having that platform that we've figured out other ways of using soft power in our church spaces that we kind of don't even feel like we have to, which is a detriment to the women that need to do it. But we have our ways.
Yeah.
We're resourceful.
Love that. Mel, maybe let's go up to 30,000 feet again here for a second.
Yeah.
Talk to us about maybe a historic frame for women preachers, because you've already kind of nailed something that's intrinsic to us here as Americans. So your Australian experiences, maybe those are just very different because of the family you grew up in, or maybe they're just cultural to Australia. Maybe you guys are just more progressive in that way. But then there's a very different experience that you can have here in America. And we could probably play that across the globe. And then across time, women have maybe spoken less, but not less importantly. There have definitely been these moments. Just riff with us for a second about women preachers from maybe a historic frame as you see it and as you understand it.
Yeah, I mean, women have been doing it. They've been doing it from day one, starting, we predate the resurrection, but starting with the resurrection onwards, women have been testifying and preaching. It's fact. And what we see a lot of times in the historical narrative of women is women would do the things that other people didn't want to do. They would open the mission to the alcoholics on the side of the road. They would be working with the homeless. They would get on a boat and go to the mission field that no one else wanted to go to. And so they would preach in those contexts where we find that women had the least amount of opportunity to preach was in majority white churches in first world countries. But everywhere else, women have been preaching and testifying to the goodness of God and opening the scriptures with fire everywhere. And I think probably because I came from Australia, our attitude was we just need anyone to preach. We didn't have the luxury of being a dominant Christian culture in Australia. And we didn't have the population to perpetrate some type of sexism. We just needed anyone we could get. We needed warm bodies. And if they happened to be female, okay, please do it. And you see a lot of the people that running churches on the frontiers were women, on reservations were women in slave holdings, running the services on the plantations, women. They were everywhere doing the work. It's just that they weren't accepted into polite white society, or I'd say maybe first world society, until maybe we see some evidence of that maybe in the last 200 years. We see that happen.
It's interesting because as you were sharing, it makes me think a little bit about the largest church in the world, which at one point, maybe it still is a church in Korea.
Yeah.
And it boasts 1 million members or something like that.
Oh, Yonggi Cho's church.
Yeah, that's right. And he grew the church through women. And he was really famous, cell group model. He got all the harmonies, the grandmothers, to go out and invite people to these small groups or these cell groups. And of course, you're not going to say no to a harmony, to a grandmother, especially in Korean culture. And so he grew the church that way, and the church just exploded sort of as a result. And that was what in Korean culture, Korean culture has a cultural archetype of kind of a hierarchy of relationships that relates from sort of Confucianism. And so women tend to be down that ladder, and yet somehow strategically through the gospel, he was I see a space for women. And they ended up becoming this church that has massive influence all over the world. So it's fascinating to hear you talk about that. It's also striking to me that one of the things that you do now, Mel, is you pastor a church, you pastor the church and you preach at the church, but you also pastor the women in the Vineyard to a certain degree. You're the association leader for women in the Vineyard. I think it's one of the beautiful things that has sort of emerged in this reorg. We have these associations of historically underrepresented voices that now actually speak and have a voice. And I think Adam and I were wondering if you could just maybe riff a little on the state of women and women preaching in the Vineyard. What's your thought about that? How many women pastors do we actually have? Are women preaching more? Have women started to preach more? What could you tell us about that in the audience listening?
Yeah, great momentum. Let's be honest. I think 20 years ago, we had 2 women that were leading churches. And now, according to the latest census, either leading or co-leading, we have nearly 200 women leading churches in the Vineyard USA alone in a lead or co-lead position, which is just incredible. And we are seeing massive momentum in the area of preaching with women. A lot of the mentoring that we do as the Women's Association is really helping women be able to advocate for sermon time, for space, pulpit space, teaching them how to, with great kindness and respectfully ask, hey, I would really love to preach. I need to preach more. Learning how to have those conversations with their pastors or with their husbands or with whoever may be their bosses to be able to advocate for that. And we're just seeing tremendous momentum. Women they're saying yes. I think they're seeing that not only is it possible, but I feel like in the Vineyard right now, the male pastors that I speak to are incredibly open and desiring to have women preaching. It's funny, I feel like I'm in this confessional space with a lot of male pastors. They'll see me at conferences and they're like, hey, I just want you to know, we're really working on getting women in. I know historically we haven't done a good job. I feel like that tide has really shifted within our movement where there is space being made for women. That's not I can't speak for every church, but for a lot of the churches that I'm interacting with, there is an open hand and an open posture. And we are helping train women on how to preach, giving them tools and resources and things like that. Because, I just think we're in a different era. I'd like to believe so anyway. Yeah,
you can see it and you can feel it too in the Vineyard. It's just more normal. And I can think of many, many great women speakers now, just right off the top of my head, Yeah. Hey, let me just dig into some of what Ted was asking. I have kind of a nuanced question. Yeah. And it has to do with the state of the Vineyard and women preachers. You said there's 200 women who are leading Vineyard churches now.
Yeah, co-leading or leading.
Yeah. That's just, it's amazing. That's so many people, especially in the span of 20 years. Okay, so talk to me about the distinction between leading and preaching or pastor and preaching. And I'll tell you what I'm thinking here, okay? Because it's been my experience, if somebody introduces themselves, if there's a guy who introduces themselves as a pastor, it's understood they're the preacher. But sometimes, you might meet a female pastor or leader, and is that the same? If they introduce themselves in the Vineyard as, oh, I help lead my Vineyard church, is there an understanding that they are also speaking? Or are they doing something else? I'm just wondering, and maybe we don't have data on this, but it's been my experience that sometimes the same mental jump that we make with the guys is not always the same mental jump that we make with the ladies. And so that's just a curiosity for me.
Is there a gap? For sure. Absolutely. Are women still doing a lot of behind the scenes work, even if they're ordained? Absolutely. Yes, that is still happening. Even I'll give you an example of my own life. I don't want to speak to anyone else. When we planted a Vineyard church 15 years ago, I was the co-lead pastor of the church, but I led the children's ministry for 3 solid years until we had someone that I trusted that would do it. And I did it unpaid. So I was an unpaid co-lead pastor of a church teaching children. And so once a month, which is great, I love teaching children, but once a month I would preach in the main adult service, and the other 3 weeks I was back with the kids. And I did that for a long time. And I think that would be a much, I would say more probably rare occurrence if that was flipped.
Yeah,
if
I
there
agree.
was, And so are we still doing those things? Absolutely we are. Yeah. Is God moving through them? Of course.
Of course.
Is he faithful? Yes. Would I like to see a little more equality in that area? Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that some of that seems to be happening, that there's more preaching happening, there's more opportunities happening. And you mentioned that one of the things that you do from your spot as the leader of the Women's Association and also a senior pastor of a church, is that you do some training and equipping, particularly of women in preaching. Could you dig into that a little bit? What does that look like?
Yeah, we have different courses that we offer in mentoring that women can sign up for and learn how to preach, be put in a cohort that is like a collective of other women, and they submit their sermons to one another. They preach them. They learn and get to receive feedback, to give feedback. And it just becomes a learning community. And I think for a lot of women, again, because of some of the patriarchal limits that have been placed on us with things like the Billy Graham rule and stuff like that, is women a lot of the time just didn't even get the opportunity to be mentored or in spaces when it was primarily male pastoral leadership. Again, I got a pass because I had a father and a husband who were both operating in that gift set, men that I could be alone with. And I was allowed to be alone with to learn the craft. But my story is not most women's stories, right? And so trying to find the opportunity for them to learn the craft. I remember Rich Nathan in my preaching and teaching class in VLI back in the day said it would take 10 years of solid preaching for me to become a really good preacher. And I was so upset because in my current environment, if I was preaching once a month, that meant it would take me 40 years to be decent. And so I had to look for other ways to practice preaching that wasn't on a pulpit Sunday morning style.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Seed and Soil, in 2 locations, Denver, Colorado on June 17th through 20th, and Cincinnati, Ohio on July 15th through 18th. We hope that by offering 2 locations and dates, everyone, pastors, leaders, volunteers, even those just curious about the Vineyard, everyone will be able to find a time to join us. The conference will have specific programming for adults, youth, and kids, while we focus on cultivating healthy soil in our hearts and planting seeds for the future for all that God wants to do in us and in the Vineyard. Registration is now open with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today.
I feel so grateful. I think both Adam and I do, that you're creating opportunities and spaces for women to be mentored, cohorts to happen. I wonder also, though, about pastors that are listening to this that are thinking, man, I've got to create more opportunity for the women in my church. I've got to equip them. Outside of that cohort, is there anything that you want to say to pastors that are listening now going, I hear that, I really want to do that? I mean, what would you tell them that they could do?
You talking to women? Am I talking to women?
Talking to women and men.
Okay. I mean, if I could talk to women first, if you are in leadership in ministry, you have a story. I happen to believe, and this is just my personal belief about preaching. I mean, I could talk about preaching for a very long time because I really care about it, but I truly believe that every preacher has one sermon, just one, that they preach in 1,000 different ways. But it is the deposit of God. It is the truth that God has personally spoken to them. It is the purpose of their life to declare. It is who they are as a person, right? And when you can drill down and find, how has God uniquely wired me and what is the message that he has called me to communicate? If you can find that, and you will find that by trial and error, but do things like, even if you don't have pulpit time right now, write sermons out and preach them to yourself. Like, go out into your neighborhood and preach them to a tree. I don't care. Like, write them out, prepare them, be ready for it. Do that. Write blog posts. They're like mini sermons. Find ways to like express yourself. Volunteer to preach at the youth group. Volunteer to preach at like a women's shelter downtown. Do whatever you can do, but start to hone that craft and say, and this is my question, right? This is my other question that I ask people a lot. Okay, this is so morbid, but if you found out that you were given an opportunity to speak one message before you died, and you were going to die, one thing that you wanted to say, what would rise to the surface in you? If you could talk about Jesus, if you could talk about your faith, and you knew that you have an audience that would listen to every single word that you say and take it inside of them and carry it forward, and then you would leave this planet, what would you say? What would be the message that you would bring? Preach that. Preach that every single chance you get. You don't need to just rehash someone else's cool sermon that you thought was lovely, or some little tidbit that's fascinating and interesting. That's great. Whatever. Big deal. People can get that anywhere. There's one message that God's called you to speak. Find it, communicate it. You will be able to sleep well at night, knowing that you are doing what God's called you to do. It's like the equivalent of the death, when people always say on their deathbed, I want my family around me because I want to say a blessing over them, right? I approach every time I stand up in front of my church as that last time. Every single time.
Yeah, memento mori.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful though. I love that. Drill down to the essence, right? Get down to the marrow.
Yes. So you can do that sometimes without a platform. You can find that, you can do that, and then your kitchen table becomes your pulpit. The playground becomes your pulpit, the workplace, water cool. You start to just share the truth that God has placed in you. So yeah, I'm always encouraging my pastors to find that one truth that God has placed perfectly inside them about Jesus. Preach it 1,000 different ways.
Mel, part of the thing that's popped up in this conversation a couple times in terms of seeing more women preaching in our churches is just simply making room in the calendar, making room in the series, just thinking about that and going, goodness gracious, we should just make a little room for these voices. Is there anything else you'd want to say to pastors who are wanting to make more room for women preachers?
Yeah. Okay, great. Hi, pastors thank you. Number one, I want to say thank you for even considering this, because I know, again, it's hard to share the crown jewels with other people in your church, because this is the fun part. Preaching is the fun part. This is the good stuff. And, I can share I only preach 22 times a year to model this in my congregation. 25 at the max, but I try and do 22, even though I'm the lead pastor. And the rest of the time I have other people that I'm training and bringing on to lead and preach in our church. So what I want to encourage you is you can do this. You don't have to preach every Sunday for your church to know that you're the lead pastor and for your church to feel safe. There are women in your congregation right now that have a story to tell, that have a perspective on Jesus that is so beautiful, and they're waiting for you to invite them to come and share that. And what you need to do is you just need to give them permission to be exactly who they are in the pulpit and not force them to fit your mode of teaching. You have to have an open-handed view of what it looks like to preach. And I think a lot of preachers, once they find their style, they think that's the only style. And I sat with a pastor once, and it was so disappointing. He told me he was training this woman to preach, but every time he met with her, she sobbed, she cried. And so she reached out to me as the Women's Association leader, and she's like, I never want to preach again. I have PTSD from these meetings. And so I called the pastor and I said, hey, what gives? And he's like, I'm the best preacher. And he said that to me. I'm the best. And she needs to learn how to preach my way. And so I will give, I am if it's hard for her, deal with it. This is what it takes to be the best preacher. And he turned her and she was so scared to preach. She would have panic attacks before she would get up there to preach. And I'm like, dude, number one, you're not the best preacher. But number two, like seriously, like her style is completely different. And why can't you bless that? Like, instead of making her look like a mini you.
I love that. Mel, you said something really that I loved a moment ago. When you started answering this question, you said that you personally preach 22 times a year. And even at 22 or 25, it's enough to make your church feel safe. And people know that you're still the senior pastor who's caring and watching and shepherding. Can you just say more about that? Because I think a lot of people have this idea that in order to be the man or to like be the leader, you know, that it takes 42 Sundays a year or maybe even more. I know a couple folks who it's like more, you know? So
yeah,
say more about a safe feeling church at 22 Sundays a year. Because I think that felt good to me when you were saying that.
Yeah. Again, you'll hear me say this a lot. I try to only speak what I know, which is my experience. I don't assume it for anyone else. But the way that I lead our church is when I am not speaking, I am still there. And I'm not still there at my church. I'm in the front row. So I lead our church from my front row way more than the pulpit. I sit in my seat in the front row, and I am the biggest cheerleader of every single person that is in our space. So our worship leaders know Mel is not going to be rolling down 3 minutes before she speaks. She's going to be in place. I could say halfway through the first song is the latest I'll be in there because I value worship. And I want our church to see me value worship. So I'm in the front row. That makes them feel safe. When Mel's in place, okay, we're safe. She's mother of the house is here and she is worshiping Jesus. When someone else is up preaching, I sit in the front row. I don't take that as an opportunity to go and have a chat in the back or go somewhere else. Like as much as I can, I'm in the front row cheering them on. I'm not going to have a meeting upstairs. I'm not doing any of that because I am leading from the front row. So I am, yes, amen. You've got this. I clap loudest. I laugh the most. Like I am in it. So it is as if I am preaching, but I sit in that front row and I bless what God is doing in our church. And because I have learned how to lead from the front row, not the stage, then it doesn't really matter who's on the stage, because if they see that mom of the house is amening and yes and present and there, then they can get behind whoever's speaking. And then it creates a safe environment for the speaker as well, because they know Mel's got my back. And if they say something wrong, which I'm sure they will, that will be a private conversation. That will never be something that I would withdraw my affection or my attention from them because I am disappointed in something that they said.
I love that. Leading from the front row.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. All right, Mel, why don't you do this? Why don't you close this out here? You're talking to the whole Vineyard, you know? Is there anything else you want to say to the Vineyard as we're on this journey of learning how to share leadership, but really learning how to share the pulpit now?
Yeah.
You know, there's a massive shift happening. So 20 years ago, there's 2 females who are leading the church. Now we are at 200. And now it feels like the shift is even towards the pulpit and towards voices that shape the Vineyard. Just what do you want to say to us as we land?
We're in a really beautiful time in the history of the church. I think it's tender and beautiful because culture is fickle. And when culture is for the church, it feels really good, but it can rot from the inside out. And we are coming off 50 years, 60 years of the church up and to the right in a lot of areas, which when things are going well, let's be honest, in all of our situations, when things go well, we overlook a lot of things because success matters, momentum matters, keeping the wheels on the bus matter. Everything's great. And so we've had that type of environment in America for a long time. And we've had the attitude, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? And what was working for a long time was one lead pastor, male, leading the church, preaching 90% of the time, having a firm direction, hopefully writing a couple of books to validate what they were saying, you know, and it was a model that produced success, right? But that model doesn't work anymore. And I actually think that's beautiful and wonderful. I think that there is a gift of God in the midst of culture shifting away from church attendance and us, you know, the people that just want to tick a box or go to the most successful church because it makes them feel good to be in a successful place that's going to give them positive tips on how to lead their business and how to be a good person. All of that stuff is fine and good, right? But we missed so much of what it really meant to be the people of God. We missed the things that couldn't be measured on metrics and numbers and tables. We missed so much. And in the space that has been cracked open with people walking away from church and church not being as sexy as it used to be, women stay. Women stay. I was at Exponential a couple of months ago, and the leader of the Baptist seminary in Ukraine was speaking, and I sobbed the entire way through his message because, you know, he talked about pre-war that they only had male pastors because they're Baptists and they knew what was right. And he said, but here they are a few years into the war. And so many of the men left, had to leave or left, had the ability to leave, but women stayed. And now the majority of the Baptist churches in Ukraine are pastored by women. And he said, we will never go back to the old way. Because women stay. Women know how to stay in hard times. And our churches need to see the women that stay because they stay for a reason. They know how to endure. They know how to persevere. And that is going to be that strength that women innately carry is going to be the container to which the next move of God will be brought about. And so if you are clinging to the old ways, you will miss out on the beauty and the joy of the container building that comes with women in the room that says, no, we know how to stick it out. We know how to major on the majors and minor on the minors. And we know how to activate the heart of the people in the congregation. We know how to create family. We know how to do that. And that is what is going to be the most attractive thing in the next 20 years in American culture is not super shiny, sexy church. It's church as family, church as home, church as a gathering place of truth-telling, storytelling, and powerful witness to the gospel of Jesus and life transformation. And and women are well equipped to carry that because they're doing it already. Yeah, they're doing it unsung. So let them at it.
That was awesome, Mel. That feels like a prophetic word in there for us, honestly. I feel that. And I don't think we're going to say anything better than that. Mel, thank you for being on the pod with us, and thanks for your leadership in the Vineyard, and thanks for your encouragement and the work that you're doing. We see it, and we feel it, and we're just thankful for it.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks,
of course.
Ted.
Hey, Zoom high five here.
Zoom high five.
There we go. Zoom high five. All right, everybody. Peace.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.